Hey guys, tonight we drift back in time, way back, to when the stars still guided every step, and the smell of crushed marigolds lingered in the air. You're standing on a causeway just outside a city unlike anything you've ever seen before. It's Tenochtitlan, an island city glittering in the middle of a lake, cradled by volcanoes and clouds, lit only by braziers, moonlight, and the occasional lightning strike. Across the causeway, the water slaps lazily against the stones, but the hum of activity around you is anything but lazy. Distant drums beat from temples where priests raise obsidian knives skyward. Canoes drift silently through narrow canals like veins pulsing through the city. In the dark, figures scurry with bundles of maize, coils of flowers, or sacks full of something suspiciously damp and earthy. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step forward, guided only by torchlight and curiosity, and you enter Tenochtitlan, not as a tourist, not as a ghost, but as a kind of time-traveling observer in soft cotton sandals. The lake, Lake Texcoco, surrounds you, salty, shallow, and deceptively calm. But it's not the lake that rules this place. It's what's been built on top of it. Your feet take you across wooden walkways and earthen ridges that weave through the city's maze of temples, homes, and gardens. By the time you pass your third canoe stand, yes, like parking lots, but wetter, you've begun to suspect something wild. This city shouldn't exist. It's floating. Or at least it looks like it is. And as the lake mist curls around your ankles and the smell of wet earth rises, you realize the truth. The Aztecs didn't conquer the wilderness. They learned to live on top of it. Literally. Welcome to a civilization that built farms on mud that floats. You pause at the edge of a canal and look out over a patchwork of green that stretches across the water. It looks like a giant tossed-down carpet swatches, neat rows of maize, beans climbing poles, pumpkins sprawling like lazy cats, and every few plots, bursts of marigolds and amaranth. But here's the catch, none of this is solid ground. It's all chinampas. Floating gardens. Human-made islands, hundreds of them, hovering just above the lake's briny surface like agricultural hoverboards. The night breeze carries the scent of damp leaves and crushed flowers. Somewhere nearby, someone's cooking tamales over a fire, and your stomach grumbles. But you're not here to eat, you're here to understand. And to do that, you've got to go way, way back. A few centuries before you arrived, sometime around the 1300s, bands of Mexican migrants trudged into the Valley of Mexico, pretty much the last ones to the party. Most of the good real estate was already taken. The valley's basin was ringed with city-states like Texcoco and Tlacopan, each lounging in relatively arable land. What did the Mexica get? Marshes, a salty lake, and an island covered in reeds and bird droppings. But instead of panicking, they did what brilliant survivors always do. They adapted. They studied the lake. They watched the waterfowl. They noticed which plants thrived in the muck. And then, as legend has it, they saw an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a snake, right there on an island. Destiny, meet inconvenient real estate. The city of Tenochtitlan began as a few huts on stilts. But slowly, the Mexica began to do something bold. They extended their land into the lake. They drove wooden stakes into the lake bed, laid down mats of reeds, piled on mud and silt and compost, then let plants take root. Over time, these became stable enough to walk on, farm on, even build on. And while all this sounds like eco-hippie dreamland stuff, make no mistake, this was a machine. A verdant, mud-covered, water-laced machine designed to feed an empire. Historians still argue whether the Aztecs invented chinampas from scratch or borrowed the idea from earlier cultures like the Xochimilca. Either way, they perfected it. You notice a man steering a canoe with a long wooden pole, gliding silently between garden plots. His face is creased by sun and time, his hands thick with calluses. In his boat, bunches of chilies, sacks of maize, and a few wide-eyed frogs staring back at you like they know something you don't. This guy? He's not a king. He's a gardener. But in Tenochtitlan, that's practically royalty. You tag along behind him as he makes his rounds. You pass gardeners waist-deep in water, prodding their chinampa edges with poles to check for erosion. You see teenage boys yanking weeds with bored expressions and surprising muscle. You watch a young woman laying down a layer of fresh mud along the edge of a garden plot like icing a cake. Her movements are rhythmic, practiced. And here's where you realize something odd. It doesn't smell bad. Not like swamps usually do. It smells alive. Earthy. Slightly fishy, but not rotting. That's because the Aztecs didn't let their gardens become bogs. They kept the water flowing, the roots oxygenated, and the mud refreshed. As you walk farther out, you pass a low wall made of volcanic rock, one of many that kept the salty water of Lake Texcoco out of the freshwater canals near the chinampas. The Aztecs, in case you were wondering, did hydrology before it was cool. A fringe theory you overhear whispered between two canoe-paddling old men? Some believe the Aztecs consulted water spirits for advice on where to plant, using rituals involving mirrors, toads, and obsidian shards. Historians mostly eye-roll at that one, but hey, you weren't there. The city glows faintly behind you now, its pyramids and palaces just a silhouette against the star-streaked sky. Out here, in the chinampa zones, it's quieter. Just the splash of paddles, the chirp of frogs, and the occasional yelp from a startled heron. You step onto one of the chinampas, it's solid. Surprisingly solid. Reeds and willow trees line its borders, their roots helping anchor the structure into place. Under your feet, soil layered over composted vegetation and lake mud offers a surprising springiness. You crouch down and scoop up a handful. It's dark. Rich. Smells like promise. A boy trots by carrying what looks like a bucket of, yep, human waste. It's bound for the compost pile. And don't make that face. We'll get to the sewage as fertilizer thing later. You're gonna love it. For now, though, you take a breath. A deep, lake-scented, flower-tinged breath. And you realize that you're not standing in ruins. You're standing in a living system, ancient, complex, and engineered to last. And as the moon climbs higher, you look back at the gleaming city. You're starting to see the truth hiding in plain sight. The grandeur of the Aztecs wasn't just in their pyramids or gold. It was in their mud. The mud that floats. You're sitting in a canoe now, the kind hollowed from a single tree trunk, long and lean like a sharpened fingernail. The boat wobbles gently with your every breath as you drift deeper into the watery heart of the Valley of Mexico. A paddle dips and swirls beside you, smooth as melted chocolate, in the hands of your guide, a wiry gardener with a reed hat, a grin that hints at too many inside jokes, and the patience of a stone. He doesn't talk much. Doesn't need to. He just points ahead. What you see doesn't make immediate sense. It's farmland. Row after row of it. Fields dense with corn stalks, plots dotted with beans, flowers poking out in colors so saturated they look animated. But this land? It's on water. It's in water. And you're paddling between them like a Venetian noble gone slightly off course. This is no ordinary farmland, it's the floating world of chinampas. If it feels like magic, that's because it almost is. You float past rows of amaranth and see a woman singing softly to her squash vines. The sound drifts across the water, echoing faintly against the willows. You hear the slosh of mud being scooped from the canal bed, the rustle of reeds being woven into walls, the low whistle of someone on a nearby boat balancing what looks like 30 chickens in a basket. This whole thing is alive, not just the crops but the system. Canals feed gardens. Gardens filter water. Trees anchor soil. People move in rhythm with the water's needs, as if the city breathes through these floating lungs. The chinampas stretch like checkerboard veins through the shallow lake. From above, they look like piano keys, long and thin rectangles laid out in gentle chaos. Most are about 30 feet wide, some hundreds of feet long. And each one? Built by hand. No cranes. No cement trucks. Just reeds, patience, and a wheelbarrow load of ambition. The idea is deceptively simple. Build a rectangle by pounding wooden stakes into the lake bed, then line the perimeter with woven mats of reeds and tree branches. Fill the interior with alternating layers of lake mud, decomposed vegetation, food scraps, and, yep, manure. Then, plant stuff on top. That's it. Except it isn't. Because this system doesn't just exist, it thrives. And it does so in one of the most challenging landscapes imaginable. Lake Texcoco was brackish, part freshwater, part saltwater, part your crops just died and your canoe smells like despair. The Aztecs didn't avoid that. They hacked it. With walls and sluices and natural filtration, they turned parts of the lake into freshwater sanctuaries for their crops. They even planted salt-tolerant reeds along the garden borders to soak up any unwanted mineral tang. Your canoe guide slaps one of these with his paddle as if to say, "That plant saved my lunch." Historians still argue whether the chinampa system was born purely out of necessity or whether it was a conscious elevation of earlier Mesoamerican farming styles. Some scholars whisper about ancient Toltec versions of aquatic farming. Others say no, the Aztecs made it their own, radicalized it. You just know that whatever it was, it worked. And here's the wild part, chinampas weren't just floating gardens. They were floating neighborhoods. In some areas, the gardens were so well established that families built homes right on top of them. Small huts, reed shelters, even stone structures perched on artificial islands barely raised above the waterline. Imagine waking up, stepping outside, and scooping your breakfast right from the soil, without ever touching dry land. You pass one of these homes now. A kid dangles a fishing line into the canal, giggling every time he pulls up a frog instead of a fish. His grandmother is crouched nearby, rubbing aloe into her feet and scowling like it's a formal job. A few ducks paddle past, completely unimpressed with your presence. This floating world wasn't a novelty, it was essential. By the peak of the Aztec Empire, over 200,000 people called Tenochtitlan home. And chinampas? They fed most of them. Let that sink in. Hundreds of thousands of mouths fed by a farm system made from sticks and sludge. And get this, chinampas were so efficient, so fertile, that they could yield up to 7 crops a year. Not 7 harvests of the same plant, 7 rotations of different foods. maize, beans, squash, peppers, tomatoes, Kia. You name it. It's like nature's version of Amazon Prime, but dirtier and with better tortillas. The secret? Constant renewal. Farmers dredged up nutrient-rich mud from the canals and smeared it onto the garden beds, recharging the soil like a living compost battery. That's right, these fields didn't wear out like modern farmland does. They improved over time. If your patch wasn't getting results, it was usually your fault. Or the gods. Or a toad spirit you forgot to bribe. You duck your head as the canoe passes under a low willow. These trees weren't just for shade or aesthetics. Willows stabilized the chinampas. Their roots ran deep and tangled, like leafy rebar. Plus, they could be harvested for branches to reinforce more garden walls. One tree, 5 jobs. The Aztecs didn't have the luxury of lazy landscaping. There's a rhythm to it, this floating world. Early mornings, farmers out dredging. Midday, women ferrying vegetables to market. Afternoons, boys hauling bundles of reeds. Evenings, elders setting crayfish traps. Nighttime, someone always seems to be singing. The lake is more than water, it's calendar, tool, and stage all at once. One fringe account tells of gardeners whispering to their crops in a mix of nahuatl, bird calls, and nursery rhymes, half for the plants, half for the lake gods. Was it science? Was it superstition? Hard to say. But the maize did grow taller after a good lullaby. You ease back into the present moment. Your guide gestures left, toward a cluster of chinampas practically glowing in the moonlight. These are the elite plots. The best of the best. Reserved for priests, nobles, and royal cooks. Here, the air smells different, spicier, more perfumed. The crops are neater. Even the ducks seem snootier. You pass a plot planted entirely with medicinal herbs, wormwood, episode, white sage. A robed man stoops to pick a sprig, then holds it to the moon before placing it in his satchel. Not a word is exchanged, but the reverence is obvious. This isn't just food. It's magic. Healing. Ritual. And still, beneath it all, there's mud. Mud hauled by hand. Layered with care. Reinforced with roots. Fed with garbage. This delicate balance of nature and human will, dancing together atop a lake that should have swallowed the whole thing up centuries ago. You reach a crossroads of canals, 4 paths meeting like a soft watery X. Your guide lets the canoe drift, then points to the sky. There, in the hush, you see it, the stars of the southern sky, glittering like scattered obsidian flakes. And just below them, reflected in the water, a mirror version, sky above, sky below. In between? Floating earth, tethered only by human hands and hope. Welcome to the Chinampa Zone. You're in it now. Your toes curl slightly as you step off the canoe and onto what your eyes insist must be land, but your instincts still whisper isn't. The ground gives a little underfoot, springy, almost like a soaked sponge that's somehow hosting a farm. And not just any farm, a spectacular, engineered patch of productivity. You've arrived at the edge of one of the oldest chinampas in this region, and right away, a realization settles into your bones. Someone built this by hand. Not in a weekend. Not even over a season. This was layered, packed, planted, reinforced, and loved across generations. You can feel it in the soil. A boy squats nearby, tying together lengths of reed with a looping confidence only repetition breeds. His job is simple: expand the edge of the chinampa by building out another raft of vegetation. But what he's really doing is repeating a sacred act that helped build a civilization. You kneel beside him, brushing your fingers along the edge of the platform. The structure isn't floating in the way a balloon floats. No, it's grounded, just barely. Anchored to the lake bed by stakes and roots, woven together like a basket of earth. It's the buoyancy of the organic layers that gives it life. It floats like a dream tethered to a plan. Want to make your own chinampa? You start by driving wooden stakes into the lake bed to mark the rectangle. They didn't use tape measures, just eyes, tradition, and maybe some divine nudging. Then comes the framework: thick mats of tule reeds, willow branches, even old cornstalks lashed and overlapped to form a base raft. This base gets covered in alternating layers: silt from the lake bottom, decaying water plants, ash, and kitchen waste. Over time, the mass gets heavier, denser, thicker. It sags just enough to rest slightly on the lake bed but remains permeable, porous enough to stay wet, springy enough not to sink entirely. That's when the planting begins. Maize in the middle. Beans climbing woven stalks. Squash at the edges, stretching their leafy fingers into the water. Each plant plays its part, like a chorus of sun-thirsty singers harmonizing in soil. The willow trees are planted next, always at the corners. They're not just symbolic, they act like anchors. Their root systems punch into the lake bed, stabilizing the chinampa, reinforcing the walls. They are living scaffolding. And if a willow dies, you plant another. That's the cycle. Nothing is waste here, not even death. Mainstream historians widely agree that chinampas represent one of the most intensive and sustainable agricultural systems ever devised. They allowed for incredible yield in minimal space and were so productive that they could support dense urban populations in the middle of a lake. But here's a twist: while they appear effortless now, it's estimated that building a single mature chinampa could take up to a year or more of patient layering and planting. Farming? Sure. But also architecture. Also engineering. Also devotion. You watch a farmer dump a canoe load of sticky black lake muck onto the garden bed. The muck glistens like pudding, smells like a fish's armpit, and is rich with nitrogen and nutrients. He spreads it with a paddle, evenly coating the topsoil. Then he murmurs a few soft words, not to you, not even to himself, but to the earth. The Aztecs believed the world was layered, like their chinampas. Under this world lay another, and under that, another. The lake was more than water, it was the skin stretched over the bones of creation. To plant in it was to connect with something deeper. Quirky fact for the night? Some chinampas were deliberately made with little gaps in the raft, where water could seep through and form micro-habitats underneath, pockets where fish, frogs, and aquatic insects could thrive. Think of it like secret Airbnb units for wildlife beneath your garden. Ecological generosity, centuries before the term existed. There's a saying from later colonial sources: where the mud lies deepest, the maize grows tallest. True, probably. But the flip side? Where the edges go unattended, the raft goes under. These gardens were only as successful as the effort they demanded. A single neglected corner could collapse, washing away weeks of work. Which brings you to the labor. This wasn't just the domain of hardened farmers. Families worked together. Children helped dredge mud, carry compost, water plants. Elders knew which willow variety had the most flexible branches. Women could rattle off which seeds needed wet feet and which hated the lake's breeze. Building a chinampa wasn't a solo act, it was community theater performed in mud and sunlight. Historians still argue whether chinampas were initially designed for subsistence or commercial surplus. Some suggest early builders made them only to feed their own households, then scaled up as city demands grew. Others think they were always part of a master plan, organized networks meant to feed entire city sectors. The truth is probably both, shifting across decades like the lake itself. Back in your present moment, a small commotion draws your attention. A man is gesturing with leafy hands, upset that someone's newly added chinampa wall is a little too close to his. A group gathers, debating boundary reeds and canal flow rights. It's not exactly neighborly. You grin. Human nature doesn't change. Turns out, maintaining floating gardens came with floating tensions. Land disputes were common, even if the land was artificial. Some families tried to secretly expand their chinampas at night, sneaking in extra reed layers to steal a few feet of planting space. Others siphoned off fresh water or redirected canals subtly. The Aztecs had officials just to monitor this. The mud police, basically. Imagine getting fined for aggressive willow placement. Still, beneath the disputes, there's a shared awe. These chinampas are more than farmland, they're tradition, status, and memory. Every one of them holds a story. A birth. A wedding feast. A lost boat. You can't step onto a chinampa without stepping into history. A woman invites you to help plant maize. You press a seed into the damp soil with your thumb, and for a moment, just a moment, you feel like you belong here. The soil, still warm from the sun. The breeze tickling your cheek. The squish of centuries under your heel. Building islands from nothing isn't just practical, it's spiritual. Every garden floats between worlds. Between water and air. Past and future. Decay and bloom. And just when you think you've absorbed it all, a canoe glides past, piled high with firewood, fish baskets, and a single solemn dog wearing a flower crown. The paddler gives you a nod. You nod back. Somehow, it all makes sense. You sit now on a narrow wooden bench balanced at the edge of a chinampa. The soil beneath your feet is damp, the reeds along the canal edge sway like whispering spectators, and something unseen below the water's surface just gave a suspicious plop. You're not alone. Beside you, a thin man in a faded cotton tunic, face like cracked leather and eyes sharp enough to slice obsidian, kneels down and gently peels back a section of soil at the water's edge. You lean closer. Underneath the surface, a strange little world squirms and bubbles to life. Welcome to the secret life beneath the water. The chinampas may look like gardens on top, but beneath them is where the magic really happens. It's like someone forgot to turn off the nature engine down here, because every inch of this murky underworld is busy doing something. You see thin white roots pushing into the water like tiny tendrils of curiosity. In between, the lake muck pulses with microorganisms, little wrigglers, slime colonies, invisible warriors digesting rot and turning it into food. Frogs croak softly under the platform. Fat eels slither through the darkness. A turtle the size of a dinner plate slowly blinks at you before deciding you're not interesting enough to bite. All this chaos? It's part of the design. Chinampas aren't just floating farms, they're ecological machines. The water filters up into the soil through capillary action, keeping roots constantly hydrated. Organic waste that floats down becomes compost. aquatic life disturbs sediment, releasing nutrients back into circulation. It's self-cleaning, self-feeding, and, if you're not too squeamish, self-sliming. The guy beside you picks up a bundle of water plants, floating green mats of algae, duckweed, and something that looks like wet spaghetti. He grins and says something in Nahuatl, then smears it directly into the soil like he's frosting a cake with pond scum. Delicious. That, he explains with his eyes more than his words, is lake fertilizer. Full of nitrogen. Full of secrets. Mainstream historians note that one of the key reasons chinampas were so outrageously productive was because they acted like wetlands, ecosystems famous for nutrient cycling and purification. Instead of draining the land to farm it, like we love doing today, the Aztecs used the water's natural power. It's like farming inside a biology textbook, except with better sandals and far fewer existential crises. The fish play a key role, too. Farmers would deliberately encourage certain species, carp, crayfish, and even axolotls, to thrive in the canals. Their waste enriched the water. Their movements stirred up nutrients. Their bodies? Extra protein. You didn't just grow food on a chinampa. You cultivated an entire food web. And that's not even the weirdest part. See that dead log poking out from the water like a forgotten limb? It's crawling with bugs, grubs, larvae, black-shelled beetles. Gross. Absolutely. But for some Aztecs, that was breakfast. Water insect eggs, when dried, became a food called a huordal, a crunchy, caviar-like delicacy that even the Spanish couldn't help but steal. One conquistador described it as delightfully nutty. Another probably just cried. You lean closer to the canal, watching a silvery school of fish flash beneath the surface. The water isn't clear. It's a sort of shifting grey-green, but it's not stagnant. That's the trick. The canals between chinampas were constantly cleaned and maintained. Silt was dredged regularly. Water was allowed to flow, slowly but consistently, via small sluices and clever use of gravity. You're told that chinampa farmers weren't just gardeners, they were canal custodians. Every week, families were expected to scrape silt from the bottom of the water channels and spread it across their garden beds. Not only did this prevent blockage, but it enriched the soil. It was a mud tax paid in sweat. Historians still argue whether the Aztecs fully understood the microbiology behind this system. Did they know the names of the bacteria transforming waste into nitrates? Probably not. Did they worship them? Maybe in their own way. What mattered was that it worked, and it worked for centuries. And it wasn't always just practical. Sometimes, it was sacred. You glance up and see an older woman whispering at the canal. She's holding a bundle of marigolds and bits of copal incense. She tosses them into the water gently. A small offering, barely more than a breath. It's not superstition, it's gratitude. You ask what she's doing, and she tells you the lake has moods. You don't argue with moods. That fringe belief, the one about the lake being a living being? Still very real to many. Some gardeners leave small tokens hidden in the canal bends, obsidian flakes, jade beads, even tiny clay frogs. Not for good luck. For balance. You crouch now and trail your fingers in the water. It's warm near the surface, cool beneath. A dragonfly lands on your knuckle and stares at you, unmoved. The water pulses around your hand like a lazy heartbeat. Everything down here is connected. Water to soil. Soil to root. root to breath. The man in the reed hat gestures for you to follow him. He drags a small net through the canal and hauls up a dripping, writhing mess of silt, sticks, water lettuce, and wriggling eels. You grimace. He beams. Then, without hesitation, he dumps the whole thing into a clay trough, scoops out the eels, and uses the rest to layer a fresh planting bed. Nothing is wasted. The gunk becomes garden. The fish go to dinner. The cycle continues. Beneath the chinampa you're standing on, microbes are digesting old roots. Worms are aerating soil. Tiny snails are cleaning algae from submerged reeds. It's a living, self-correcting matrix, with each player, seen or unseen, performing a role they never auditioned for. And the humans above? Just caretakers. Not controllers. Stewards of a system older than empires. You take a deep breath. The air smells of wet leaves, rich soil, and just the faintest hint of fish. Somewhere in the distance, a heron cries out like a broken flute. You stand now, stretching, watching the surface of the water ripple like a page turning. Below that layer is mystery. Movement. Memory. So when someone tells you the chinampas were floating gardens, you smile quietly to yourself. You've seen what floats. You know what swims. And now, you've met what lives in between. You crouch at the edge of a chinampa, your fingers sinking into the thick, dark muck with a satisfying squish. It clings to your skin like warm brownie batter, but the smell quickly kills any dessert metaphors, pungent, fishy, and sour-sweet, with just a hint of mysterious rot. But here, in this glistening goop, lies the secret to an empire's feast. Mud is magic. Sort of. You raise your hand and let the sludge ooze through your fingers. This isn't ordinary dirt. It's lakebed sediment, what farmers call tlayliadal, a Nahuatl word that basically means earth mixed with water and smells like dead snail. And if you asked an Aztec gardener which god they prayed to most, they'd probably just point to this squishy substance and say, that one. It all comes down to nutrients. Unlike the dry, dusty fields you may have visited on a school trip, where farmers need to add fertilizers, rotate crops, and cry softly over spreadsheets, chinampas used lake mud. Constantly replenished, eternally rich, and bursting with nitrogen, phosphorus, and other chemical goodies, this mud is the living bloodstream of the floating garden. You watch a teen boy, barefoot, grumpy, and probably on chinampa duty for ditching temple school, plunge a long-handled scoop into the canal. He lifts out a mound of shimmering black sludge and dumps it into a waiting wheelbarrow. Over and over. This isn't punishment. This is maintenance. Chinampa farmers dredge regularly, not just to deepen canals but to feed their plots. And they do it year-round. That's one of the big differences between Aztec agriculture and what came before. With these floating farms, there was no fallow season. No hibernation. As long as you had access to fresh mud, you could grow. The lake never sleeps, so neither does the harvest. Mainstream historians agree, this mud-based system allowed the Aztecs to achieve crop yields that astonished even the Spanish. Some reports mention up to 7 harvests a year on a single chinampa. Whether or not that number was exaggerated, spoiler, it probably was. The fact remains, Aztec agriculture was freakishly productive, and lake mud was the MVP. But not all mud is created equal. Your guide, a wiry woman named Tequi, grabs your wrist before you dump a sloppy handful of muck onto a squash mound. Not that mud, she says with a grin. That mud's too young. Too young? Apparently yes. Mud, like cheese or gossip, needs time to ripen. She shows you the difference. Fresh dredged muck is full of plant matter, fish droppings, and pond slime. It needs time to cook in the sun before it's garden ready. Otherwise, it can smother roots and invite pests. Tequi spreads her young mud into shallow drying basins lined with reeds, letting the sun bake it into a rich, almost fluffy compost. Then it's used to top off the chinampa soil like fertilizer frosting. You ask what happens if you skip the drying step. She shrugs and says, "The maize cries." Enough said. Historians still argue whether the Aztecs understood soil chemistry the way we do today. Did they know about nitrogen fixation or pH balances? Probably not in modern terms. But they knew that certain muds were better for certain crops. That mixing in ash from burnt reeds helped balance things. That too much wet could drown roots and too little made the soil sulk. Trial and error, times 10 generations. Some of this might have been ritualized. You hear a whisper of a fringe practice, a moon timing tradition where farmers only harvested canal mud during a waning crescent moon. Something about coaxing the water spirits while they slept. Historians roll their eyes at that one. But Tequi? She definitely paused when she saw tonight's moon. You help her ladle pre-aged mud into shallow rows between young chili plants. The texture is smooth and somehow bouncy. The smell is tolerable now. Each row is planted with precision. Rows this way, footpaths that way. No wasted space. No gaps. Every inch of the chinampa is used or planned for. Off to your left, two men pull a canoe heavy with human waste, collected from public latrines in the city. Yes, you're seeing this right. In Tenochtitlan, waste wasn't waste. It was asset allocation. Even poop had a purpose. Hot mud, Tequi calls it, pointing at the bucket. Too strong on its own. Mix with canal silt. Then it's gold. You make a mental note not to step anywhere that's still steaming. And it's not just maize or squash that benefits. Medicinal herbs, flowers, amaranth, tomatoes, every crop feeds off this fermented buffet of lake sediment, composted plant matter, and, yes, excrement. Chinampas are essentially one long nutrient cycle with leaves on top and mud beneath. You pass a field of beans climbing stalks, their roots glistening where the soil has been freshly turned. They're practically vibrating with health. The leaves are so green it's almost tacky. You ask how old the soil is. Tequi thinks for a moment and says, "My grandmother's grandmother started that chinampa." You nod slowly. That tracks. One quirky tradition you hear about involves tuning the soil by mixing in specific flower petals. Marigold for vigor. Passion flower for humidity. Cacao husks for aeration. Do they help? No one's measured. But the gardens do look prettier. And honestly, can science measure vibes? By midday, your back aches and your feet are caked in 3 layers of sticky nutrients. Tequi hands you a bowl of atoll, a warm maize drink sweetened with honey and thick enough to stand a spoon in. Good for sore legs, she says, watching you wobble like a newborn heron. You sip it, watching other farmers layer fresh soil across rows of tomato plants. The air smells like sunbaked clay and mint. A few chinampas over, someone plays a flute carved from bone. You catch yourself swaying slightly. The mud has gotten into your bones, your blood. And suddenly you get it. This isn't just farming. This is performance art. It's alchemy. It's faith. Its family passed down through compost and song. And the floating mud? Still here. Still feeding it all. Still working while no one's watching. The sun is lower now, casting golden light across the canal water like someone spilled a jar of honey and let it ripple with the breeze. You walk the narrow earthen ridge between two chinampas, trying not to fall in, again. The damp soil squishes beneath your sandals, the trees rustle, and a dragonfly does a near-miss flyby of your nose. Ahead of you, a pair of men are wrestling with what looks like a fence made of spaghetti. Except it's not pasta, it's willow branches. Long, flexible, living ones. They twist and lash them together like a giant, swamp-born basket. This isn't just arts and crafts. This is structural engineering, Aztec style. Welcome to the part where you learn how not to sink. Chinampas may be floating, but that doesn't mean they're loosey-goosey rafts just drifting around like lazy lily pads. No way. These gardens are anchored, boxed, and bound with strategy. Think less floating and more suspended, tethered tightly to the lake bed with natural materials that had to do 5 jobs at once. The foundation begins with a wicker framework of sticks and reeds, mostly tule and willow. Tule, soft, buoyant, waterproof, is the marshmallow of the engineering world. Willow, strong, flexible, and alive, is the rebar. Together, they form a kind of fence or box around the chinampa site. It keeps the soil in. It resists erosion. And when done right, it actually grows stronger over time as the willows sprout and root themselves deeper. You watch the men lash together a new fence, their hands moving fast, looping vines like old pros. They don't use nails. Just clever knots and pressure. Occasionally, they whack a stake into the lake bed with a flat stone and grunt in approval when it stays put. You step closer to inspect the fence. It's not perfect, some gaps, some awkward angles, but it doesn't have to be. It just has to last. And it has to stay firm enough to resist the wobbles. And oh, the wobble is real. You step onto a newly built section of chinampa and immediately feel like you're standing on a half-deflated mattress. Your knees jerk instinctively to balance. The soil jiggles slightly. It's not sinking, but it's not exactly comforting either. You glance down and realize the only thing stopping you from becoming one with the lake is a foot of bundled sticks and centuries of gardening confidence. One of the builders grins and tells you, the garden tests your ankles before it feeds your stomach. Fair. But the wobble has its benefits. Slight flexibility means the platform can absorb motion from wind and water. Like an ancient suspension bridge, the chinampa gently sways rather than snaps. That's why rigid materials like stone were rarely used in the structure. Too brittle, too heavy, too loud. Nature prefers a quiet bounce. Mainstream historians have noted the brilliance of this blend of biology and physics. By using materials that continued to live and grow, especially willow, the chinampas became semi-living structures. The trees acted as anchors, walls, and stabilizers. The roots intertwined with the fence, pulling everything downward. Over time, the fence didn't decay, it evolved. Grew stronger. Got weirdly lumpy. Just like you after holiday leftovers. Now, imagine building hundreds of these. Thousands, even. The Valley of Mexico was covered in them, acres and acres of floating rectangles, each bordered by living fences and accessed by narrow causeways or canoe. You didn't just build a chinampa. You built a neighborhood. And with neighborhoods come zoning issues. historians still argue whether there were formal regulations on chinampa dimensions. Some sources suggest state-supervised planning. Others think it was more free-form, plant and pray. But we know this: the fences mattered. A weak edge could cause a collapse. A crooked barrier meant your tomatoes ended up in someone else's squash patch. Fences made good neighbors, especially when those neighbors were also hungry. There's a fringe belief that willow branches were selected on specific feast days to ensure spiritual harmony. Farmers supposedly sang to their saplings before cutting them. Sound odd? Maybe. But considering these branches were literally holding their livelihood together, a little serenade seems fair. You step back and watch as another group finishes planting their border. The young willows sway slightly in the wind, their leaves flickering silver and green. Within a few months, their roots will reach down and start the anchoring process. In a year, they'll be fence, wall, and shade tree all in one. That's the genius of it: multi-use materials. Nothing was just one thing. A willow wasn't just a tree, it was a post, a tool, a living lock. You're handed a pole and invited to help tamp in some reeds. The process is almost soothing. Insert, press, loop, press, tie. The rhythm pulls you in. The wind quiets. A nearby heron lets out a weird cough. You ignore it. Eventually, the chinampa edge takes shape. The mud inside is already being prepared for planting. Some parts are higher, dry, and ready for maize. Others stay lower, wetter, perfect for squash or herbs. Water laps gently against the outer fence. A little wave seeps through, depositing fine silt. Free fertilizer. And when it rains? Even better. Chinampas are slightly raised above the canal, so water drains back down into the lake. No flooding. No runoff. Just a nice, muddy sip. By afternoon, the structure is done. You sit on a newly placed log and watch ducks peck at the water's edge. They're part of the system too, eating bugs, dropping gifts, repeating the cycle. Then a boat drifts past, low, flat, and carrying something truly terrifying: a load of babies. Not just human babies. Tree babies. These are willow cuttings, freshly snipped and ready for transplant. The boatman, a teen with an impressive eyebrow ring, probably made from bone, tells you they'll be stuck in new fences across the lake. It's an ancient propagation method. Snip a branch, poke it in the mud, let nature do the rest. You help plant one at the far edge of the chinampa. It stands there, skinny and slightly floppy, like a kid on the first day of school. But in a few years, it'll be a wall. A root system. A home for birds. A quiet part of you is impressed. No fancy tech. No imported materials. Just nature, understood deeply, repurposed respectfully. Willow. Reeds. Mud. And a whole lot of patience. You wipe your hands on your tunic, realizing it doesn't help. There's mud on your elbows, your knees, even your eyebrow, don't ask. But there's something comforting about it. The chinampa isn't just built, it's becoming. Wicker bones. Willow tendons. Mud muscle. All of it working together to float, not because it resists the lake, but because it understands it. And you? You're starting to feel the same way. You wake to the sound of soft paddling, distant voices, and the sharp caw of a bird that's definitely judging your sleep posture. You've spent the night curled up under a reed canopy beside a chinampa, the ground still spongy, still humming with life. Morning light filters through the mist like a lazy promise. And the air? The air smells like maize dough, wet bark, and something faintly spicy. You stretch, wipe mud from your cheek, again, and follow the gentle clatter of activity echoing down the canals. It's market day in Tenochtitlan. You hop into a passing canoe, guided by a cheerful farmer with forearms that could crush avocados into guacamole by accident. His boat is piled high with fresh produce, chili peppers glowing like rubies, leafy greens, tomatoes still dusted with soil, and baskets full of something that looks suspiciously like edible flowers. "You hungry?" he asks, handing you a small tamale. You nod because this is clearly a test of character, and the answer is always yes. He paddles with ease, weaving through a maze of watery lanes as the chinampas roll past like slides on an endless green projector. Every one of them contributes to the economy you're gliding into, an economy floating on mud, reeds, and cornmeal dreams. Mainstream scholars agree, chinampa agriculture was the heart of Aztec food production. Without it, Tenochtitlan, the gleaming, lake-cradled capital with upwards of 200,000 residents, couldn't have existed. The city wasn't surrounded by farmland. It was farmland. The water was a road, a pantry, and a trash can all at once. As your canoe rounds a bend, you get your first glimpse of the action, the Tlatelolco market. This is no village trade post. This is Walmart meets Burning Man, times 1,000. People are shouting prices, comparing goods, arguing over eggplants. There are tamale vendors, feathered traders, fruit weavers, obsidian polishers, and even a dude selling tiny turtles, unclear whether for pets or snacks. And right there at the center? Farmers from the chinampas, unloading boatloads of produce onto reed mats with practiced choreography. You watch as maize gets piled into neat pyramids. Squash is lined up like bowling pins. Chilies spill from their baskets like someone kicked over a bag of fireworks. Your guide joins a line of vendors and starts offloading his harvest. Tomatoes, beans, leafy greens, each sorted, cleaned, and proudly displayed. You help arrange a bundle of amaranth and accidentally drop a squash on someone's foot. The woman glares, then hands you another one to carry. Welcome to the food network of the Aztecs. Each chinampa family had its specialty. Some grew maize and beans, the staples. Others focused on herbs, flowers, or luxury crops like cacao pods and vanilla orchids. Some chinampas were so fertile and so productive that they exclusively supplied temples and the imperial palace. Yes, even royalty ate salad. Sorry to break it to you. And the scale? Let's talk numbers. At their peak, chinampas covered nearly 9,000 hectares of the lake zone. That's the size of 20,000 football fields, only, instead of yelling coaches and Gatorade, there were hummingbirds, wind chimes, and acrobatic squirrels. Historians estimate these floating plots produced enough food to feed hundreds of thousands, possibly more. All without plows. All without wheels. Just paddles, mud, and cleverness. You wander through the market, marveling at the sheer variety. There's maize in every form, fresh, dried, popped, even powdered. There are chilies with names you can't pronounce but desperately want to try. You pass a stall entirely devoted to edible flowers. Another is selling fermented honey drinks and cactus jelly. One older man tries to convince you to buy fried grasshoppers. You politely decline, then immediately regret it. The point is, This market thrives because the chinampas don't just float. They function. They're not decoration. They're the empire's stomach. You sit on a stone bench chewing a roasted squash blossom, watching as porters haul baskets up onto causeways. They're headed into the city proper, bound for temples, merchant houses, and royal kitchens. And then it hits you. This whole system, this whole economy, it works because it moves. The water moves. The canoes move. The mud moves. The crops move. Nothing is static. That's the genius. Historians still argue whether this movement was centrally controlled or a brilliant accident of design. Did officials coordinate canal schedules? Did temples tax chili peppers? Were there canal tolls? Possibly. Probably. No one agrees. But what's certain is that it worked. And it worked better than most dryland empires ever managed. You overhear a vendor bragging that his maize grows faster because he sings to it. Another swears by feeding her tomatoes crushed eggshells and morning gossip. A third scoffs and says it's all in the mud, and he stirs his with a carved obsidian spoon for flavor. Fringe or not, it's hard to argue with the results. Suddenly, there's a commotion at the edge of the market. A canoe has tipped, dumping a load of beans and one very soggy merchant into the drink. People laugh. A boy wades in and scoops up the beans. No one panics. This is just life here, messy, buoyant, hilarious. You help your guide pack up after a few trades, and the canoe floats lower in the water on the return trip, now loaded with barter goods, fresh cloth, salt cakes, a new reed mat, and, because no one can resist, a small clay flute shaped like a lizard. As you paddle back through the chinampa maze, the late morning sun sparkles off the water. Ducks quack from the canals. Willows sway. And all around you, people are farming, singing, dredging, planting. You glance over at a woman spreading new soil with practiced strokes. Another is teaching her son to spot disease in the bean leaves. An elder hums softly as he drops fish bones into the compost pile. They're not just feeding themselves. They're feeding everyone. And here's a twist. Chinampas didn't just produce food. They produced jobs. Dredgers, builders, weavers, porters, canoe carvers, even bug collectors. The system created economic ripples that stretched from the lake to the market to the palace. This isn't a quaint, primitive farm. This is a vertically integrated, hydroponic empire disguised as a garden. And in the center of it all? The humble mud. The quiet water. The reeds. The rhythm. It's not glamorous. But it's sacred. And as your canoe slides back into the shade of the willows, you realize something. You could have built temples, carved statues, even launched conquests. But if you couldn't grow food, your empire would starve. The chinampas made sure it didn't. The air's a little sharper now, late afternoon settling in like a slow exhale. Shadows stretch across the chinampas, long and lean, sliding over maize stalks and squash vines like creeping fingers. You're walking along a narrow causeway between garden plots, when a sudden splash makes you flinch. You spin around. Nothing, just ripples on the water. You keep walking. Another splash. Still nothing. Then a snicker from behind a papyrus bush. You part the reeds and find a skinny kid hiding there, a basket of freshly scooped mud in one hand and the most suspicious grin you've ever seen on a human being. He darts away before you can say anything, disappearing into the maze of chinampas like a mudslick ghost. Welcome to the underbelly of paradise. Because as lush and serene as these floating farms might look, let's be real, when land is water, and water is food, and food is power, things get complicated. Today, you're going to see what happens when all that mud becomes a battleground. Plot wars, mud heists, passive-aggressive reed sabotage. You follow a rising trail of argument echoing from around a canal bend, and sure enough, a group of farmers are in full-blown dispute mode. There's yelling. There's arm waving. There's pointing at the ground as if yelling, "This is my edge," will convince anyone. One man even jabs his paddle into the mud to draw an invisible boundary. Turns out, he's accusing his neighbor of extending their chinampa too far into shared canal space, effectively stealing a chunk of prime planting territory. It's the floating equivalent of building a fence 3 feet onto your neighbor's driveway. And out here, those 3 feet could mean the difference between your family eating squash stew or squash soup, without the squash. These weren't rare incidents. In fact, disputes over chinampa borders were common enough that local officials were assigned just to mediate them. The Aztecs had land surveyors, waterway monitors, and boundary arbitrators. Their job? Walk the ridges, settle arguments, and document who planted what and where. No Google Maps. Just paddles, stone markers, and one very long memory. You trail the argument to a small open space where several gardeners gather around a reed mat covered in tokens, small painted stones representing individual chinampas. This is a neighborhood council meeting. Today's agenda? Who expanded illegally and whether their willow border should be cut back or just mysteriously disappear one night. Historians still argue whether the Aztecs had formal written records of chinampa ownership or whether it was all oral tradition. Likely a mix of both. Some noble families definitely had documentation, deeds carved into bark or inscribed with pictographs. Others? Just long-standing agreements, the kind of, "that's been our plot since great-granddad wrestled a heron" that vibe. But here's the thing, everyone watched everything. It's hard to steal land when your neighbor's hut is 20 feet away, and their mother-in-law sits outside all day shelling beans with laser eyes. And yet, people tried. One trick: expanding your chinampa just a little at a time. Add a few reeds here, dump a little mud there. Do it at night, or during festival week, or when your neighbor's off having a spiritual crisis in the mountains. Slow, sneaky, almost romantic, if you're into soil-based betrayal. Another method? Undercutting. Literally. A canoe paddler drags a long pole through a rival's canal bed, scooping away the edge soil so the plot starts to slouch and erode. Next rainy season, whoops! The garden shrinks, and the canal accidentally shifts. But steady. She holds a chili flower like it's sacred. Because here, it is. The chinampas weren't just food factories. They were apothecaries. Healing centers. Pharmacies disguised as floating gardens. Some plots were even dedicated entirely to medicinal plants, cultivated for use in temples and healing houses. Priests and Ticidal worked closely, blending ritual and remedy in ways that modern medicine still struggles to translate. You spot a man paddling by with a canoe full of bundled herbs, bound for a temple in Tenochtitlan. You recognize a few: copal resin, white sage, cempasúchil. Others are mysteries. For the dead, McQuiston whispers. For those who speak with smoke. You sit beside her, watching the mist rise from the canal. She tells you of dreams, how certain plants appear to her in sleep, how the lake sometimes tells her what's needed. Historians might call this intuition. You call it poetry. You notice how she plants according to the moon, how she blesses the soil before harvest, how she never plucks without permission. You start to understand that the plants aren't tools here. They are partners. Some historians argue whether these rituals had scientific merit or were merely symbolic. But when you see the health of her garden, lush, balanced, bursting with fragrance, you wonder if it even matters. The results speak louder than the debates. You learn a few Nahuatl phrases. Tlen nekwali? What ails you? Tlen moiksha? What hurts? Tlezo kamadi, thank you. You try to use them. McQuisson laughs gently at your accent, then gives you a leaf to chew. For better words, she says. Your mouth goes numb. Some quirks of Aztec herbalism remain elusive. There are records of dream leaves, plants used not to heal the body but to send visions. Of frog skins soaked in potions. Of smoke baths combining herbs and heat to sweat out sadness. Some of this sounds mythical. Some of it works. As the sun begins to slide westward, McQuisson lights a bundle of sage and walks the edge of her chinampa, smoke curling around the plants like a protective barrier. A blessing. A goodbye. You ask if all gardeners do this. She smiles. Some only with words. Some only with water. Some with silence. I use smoke. The plants know me this way. You feel that deep. Like the soil itself sighed. Before you leave, she gives you a small pouch of crushed herbs for your sleep. You take it. No label. No dosage. Just trust. You paddle away slowly, looking back at her garden, which now seems less like a patch of ground and more like a woven spell. The plants sway, shimmer, whisper. And somewhere in their roots, the old knowledge curls, waiting to be remembered. You breathe in the lake air, the smell of herbs still clinging to your skin. You're not healed. Not exactly. But something inside you has definitely shifted. Because now, you don't just see a plant. You listen to it. The chinampa morning is calm again, almost suspiciously so. Birds wheel lazily overhead. Canoes drift by in silence. The maize stalks rustle, the flowers sway, and everything seems too perfect. Which means it's time to talk about something deeply unglamorous. Something absolutely vital. You crouch at the edge of a canal, nose wrinkling, as a flat-bottomed canoe comes into view. It's not loaded with vegetables, or flowers, or baskets of healing herbs. It's loaded with poop. Specifically, human waste. A rich, steaming, humming pile of it. Right there, in wide shallow baskets. Brown, crumbly, and, if you want to be generous, surprisingly uniform. The man guiding the canoe is completely unfazed, whistling a jaunty tune and occasionally using his paddle to adjust a particularly enthusiastic turd that keeps trying to escape. Welcome to the glamorous world of Aztec sanitation. Or, as we are calling it today, rivers of poo and glory. You might want to hold your breath. But also, maybe don't. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. This smell? This cargo? It's not waste. It's wealth. And in a floating agricultural system built on cycles and renewal, this is the final, fragrant loop. The Aztecs were among the first to practice large-scale recycling of human waste. It wasn't dumped or hidden. It was harvested, valuable, part of the daily grind. And here in the Chinampa zones, it was crucial. This canoe you're gagging beside? It's bound for one of the composting platforms, little floating barges built from reed mats and surrounded by piles of ash, fish bones, crushed shells, and silt. The waste is laid between all that organic matter, then left to bake in the sun. Over time, it breaks down, sterilizes, and transforms into what farmers lovingly call tlazoli, the discarded made sacred. Mainstream historians agree, the Aztecs had one of the most advanced systems of urban sanitation in the ancient world. Public latrines weren't just dumping grounds, they were collection points. Porters, called tlacolatl, made daily rounds, collecting chamber pots from homes, temples, even the palace. Then it all went into boats and floated its way right here. Into the Chinampas. Well, not directly. That would be gross. No, this stuff was processed. Dried. Mixed. Aged like a fine wine you never, ever want to drink. Then carefully worked into the soil to enrich the top layers. You watch as a farmer scoops out a perfect scoop of processed compost. It's no longer smelly. Just dark. Rich. Earthy. He crumbles it into the base of a squash plant with the reverence of someone seasoning soup. And honestly, it's kind of beautiful. You help stir one of the compost heaps, using a long reed rake. The pile steams gently. It's warm. Alive. Full of worms. Also, yes, a few beetles that crawl out and wave at you like smug little engineers. You don't wave back. Fringe reports claim that some Chinampa farmers could identify a person's diet based on the quality of their waste. Too much maize? Too loose? Lots of beans? Fertile but explosive. And Noble's compost? Refined, floury, soft. That one's probably a joke. Probably. But here's something amazing. Nothing in Tenochtitlan went to waste. Not food scraps. Not bones. Not even human hair. All of it made its way, eventually, to the Chinampas. If it could rot, it could be used. The city was a digestive system, and the Chinampas were its stomach. Even ashes from temple fires were sprinkled over compost heaps to calm the spirits, as one old woman tells you. The gods get angry if you bury fire without feeding it dirt. You nod solemnly, unsure whether she's serious. She is. Historians still argue about how widespread this system was. Did every household contribute? Were there incentives? Was this a centralized municipal function or an informal community responsibility? Some records suggest state oversight. Others imply a decentralized network of poop entrepreneurs. Either way, it worked. And let's talk logistics. Imagine the coordination. Dozens, maybe hundreds, of small canoes loaded with different types of waste, timed, routed, managed. Farmers requested delivery. Porters negotiated rates. A bad batch could ruin a plot. A good one? It could save a harvest. There's a rhythm to it, just like everything else. You watch as a new load arrives. The boatman docks gently, unloads with practiced motions, and chats casually with the gardener as if this is no more strange than delivering firewood. Which, for him, it isn't. You ask him how long he's done this. He grins. My father hauled waste. My grandfather too. Best compost runners in the city. My son's next. Legacy, it turns out, comes in many forms. As the sun climbs higher, the compost crew invites you to share a meal. You politely decline the finger food and opt for a tortilla dipped in chili sauce, because no matter how recycled the land is, you still need mental separation. They joke, of course. You've probably eaten squash grown in your cousin's leftovers. You laugh nervously. Then remember how good that squash was. Ha! There's pride here. Not mockery. Not disgust. The waste cycle is sacred. Necessary. Even noble. The Aztecs saw no shame in returning to the earth what the earth once gave. And here's the kicker: modern science backs them up. Composting human waste, when done properly, is not only safe but incredibly effective. It rebuilds soil, reduces reliance on synthetic fertilizers, closes the nutrient loop. It's what regenerative agriculture dreams of being. But the Aztecs? They just called it Tuesday. You help shovel a fresh layer of reeds over a drying compost pile. Then you wash your hands in the canal, twice. The water here is clean, filtered naturally by the roots of the chinampas, and flowing slow enough to settle the silt. You sit on the bank and watch a line of poop canoes paddling down the far canal, trailing behind them a slow-moving scent and a very real future. You wonder how many temple rituals were fed by those gardens. How many noble feasts. How many songs, dances, battles, treaties, fueled by vegetables grown in recycled humanity. It's not gross. It's poetic. The cycle of life, one scoop at a time. The wind has picked up. It rustles the willows harder than usual, sending thin branches into swirling dances above your head. Out on the lake, the water isn't smooth anymore. It's choppy, restless, slapped into small waves by a storm that hasn't arrived yet but is definitely whispering its plans. The floating world doesn't feel so steady now. You tighten your cloak and glance down the length of the chinampa. The maize stalks are bending too much. The chili vines are twisting in directions they shouldn't. The edges of the plot quiver like a too-full tray of soup. For the first time in days, you feel like this miracle of engineering might actually fall apart. Turns out, even mud has limits. You spend the day learning about what happens when the weather turns against the chinampa system. And it's not pretty. Let's start with wind. Not the gentle kind that flutters reeds and tickles your neck. We're talking the seasonal kind that roars across the lake like a spoiled sky god throwing a tantrum. These gales don't just knock over plants. They push water into canals, flood the soil, and in the worst cases, literally peel the reed walls off the edges of chinampas like flaps of wet cardboard. You watch a group of farmers bracing their borders, tying down corner willows, reinforcing edges with extra stone and bundled reeds. We've lost 2 rows before, one of them says. Gone in the night. Like they were never there. You ask if this happens often. He squints at the sky and shrugs. Only when the lake's angry. But there's something worse than the wind. Something slower. Sneakier. A long-term enemy. Salt. Lake Texcoco wasn't a freshwater paradise. It was brackish, part salty, part muddy, part alkaline enough to make even hardy plants go, nope. The Aztecs knew this. That's why they constructed dikes and levees, barriers made from stone, wood, and labor, to separate freshwater canal zones from saltier sections of the lake. But those barriers? They weren't invincible. Historians agree that managing water salinity was a constant challenge. The lakes around Tenochtitlan fluctuated wildly depending on rain, drought, and snowmelt from the surrounding mountains. When fresh water was plentiful, the chinampas thrived. When it wasn't, the salt crept in. You crouch by a plot that's sick. The plants are yellowed. The soil has a pale crust on top. A farmer breaks off a leaf and crumbles it in his hand. Salt, he says grimly. Again. There's little you can do once salinization takes hold. It poisons the roots. It hardens the soil. It stops the sacred mud from breathing. One bad season could ruin a plot. 2. A family. One fringe theory says that salt itself was a spirit, something that had to be fed cornmeal and blood in tiny offerings at the edge of the dikes. Otherwise, it got angry, possessive, hungry. You're not sure if that's science, but after smelling this soil, you're not going to argue. You travel farther out, toward the edge of the chinampa zone. Here, the wind is stronger, the water darker. And the gardens? Rougher. Less maintained. One platform is half submerged, its once neat rows of squash now a soggy mess. A collapsed fence floats nearby, tangled in reeds and gilt. This was old land, a boy tells you. No one fixed it. It's easy to imagine how it could happen. A family moves away. The plot erodes. The dike upstream breaks. Suddenly, the balance is gone, and once it goes fast. And sometimes, the damage isn't natural. Storms aren't the only thing that sink chinampas. You meet a man, scarred, tight-lipped, who tells you about the time rival factions sabotaged each other's plots. Cut willow roots. Undermined levees. Dumped saltwater into the wrong canals. We fought with paddles and shovels, he says, chuckling without humor. Historians still argue whether chinampa collapse was more often environmental or political. Droughts? Yes. Storms? Definitely. But also, land grabs, tribute conflicts, civil tensions. A floating world is easy to tip with the right push. And then there's disease. Blights, mildew, insects. You see a patch of amaranth turn black by fungus. A whole row of tomatoes infested with tiny beetles that glitter like metal. Even here, surrounded by water, the land isn't safe from nature's dark jokes. In response, the farmers adapt. You help haul fresh mud from the canal to relayer a sick chinampa. You help with new reed fences. You stir compost that includes crushed shells, an old trick to fight salt damage. The work is constant, tireless, faith-driven. And it's still not always enough. There are stories, quiet ones, about plots that were abandoned. Gardens that sank, bit by bit, into the lake. You pass one now. A rectangular depression barely visible, its fence half gone, its trees dead. The water's deeper here. Still. Silent. Some call these ghost chinampas. Others say they sleep. Waiting. But it's not all gloom. You see hope, too. A group of teens planting new willows on a flooded edge. A grandmother teaching her granddaughter to test soil softness with a reed stick. A canoe loaded with young fish, tilapia, to restock a canal for better pest control. This system wasn't built on perfection. It was built on persistence. A floating farm doesn't resist nature. It learns from it. Shifts with it. Adapts. Even as the wind howls louder and the sun hides behind darkening clouds, the farmers continue their work. They know that tomorrow the water might rise. The mud might sour. The fence might fail. But they plant anyway. You stand at the edge of a chinampa that's been rebuilt 4 times. You run your fingers along the new willow branches, still green, still fragile. And you realize something that hits deeper than all the history books combined. This world floats not because it avoids failure, but because it refuses to sink. You're ankle deep in lake water, hauling bundles of reed mulch toward a chinampa edge that's looking a little worse for wear. The willow posts sag. The squash vines droop. Everything is wet, but not in the good, rich mud kind of way. This is a defeated, storm-tossed, too much water kind of wet. You glance up. Boots. Heavy, clinking, too clean boots. You freeze, rake in hand, heart beating like a war drum. They've arrived. Spanish boots, polished and foreign, step from the edge of a causeway and onto the ancient reeds. Behind them, armor gleams under the brutal sun. Metal rattles. Horses snort. A priest mutters a prayer. And the floating world of the chinampas, so carefully balanced, so lovingly tended, quivers under their weight like it knows what's coming. This is the moment everything begins to unmoor. It's 1519, or close enough, and Hernan Cortez has just walked into a city he does not understand. He sees temples, gold, people bowing, markets, exotic food, and somewhere in the background, a lush maze of greenery stretching across the water like a miracle someone forgot to fence off. You hide behind a pile of reeds and watch them walk. The Spaniards don't understand chinampas. Not really. To them, it's just wet farming. They don't see the centuries of layering, the mud rituals, the microecologies, the balance of water and labor and faith. They see garden plots in a swamp. And, more importantly, they see something useful. Land they can take. Resources they can extract. People they can tax. Mainstream historians agree that one of the first things the conquistadors noticed was the fertility of the chinampa system. They were shocked at how much food the city could produce. They compared the gardens to Venice, but faster, greener, and feeding more people. They didn't say it with admiration. They said it with opportunity. You creep through the vines as Spanish soldiers pass by, their weapons gleaming like angry sunbeams. One of them pokes at the soil with the tip of a halberd and mutters something about soft ground and stinking lakes. He laughs. The laugh feels like vinegar poured on honey. A local farmer kneels beside a tomato plant, pretending not to hear. His hands are steady, but his eyes flicker. He's done this before. Worked through danger. But this? This isn't another drought. This isn't a salt surge. This is conquest. The Spanish begin asking questions. Who owns these plots? Where is the tribute collected? Who decides what is planted? Where does the compost go? You know what they're doing. So does the farmer. They are measuring. Soon, the demands begin. More maize for the garrison. Squash for the soldiers. Peppers for the noble kitchens that have now been reassigned to the new rulers. The chinampa workers are told to continue, as usual. Plant, harvest, deliver. Except now, usual includes paying tribute to strangers. You visit the market a few days later and the change is already visible. Spanish flags hang over the temples. Local vendors shrink from the path when soldiers pass. The canoe traffic is heavier, more frantic. Food is still flowing, but the faces of the farmers have shifted. There's tension now. Grief. And worst of all? Confusion. Because the chinampa system doesn't translate. Spanish land ownership models, rigid, feudal, fenced, don't make sense here. They try to impose boundaries, draw maps, assign ownership. But how do you map a floating garden? How do you sell mud? Historians still argue whether the Spanish ever fully understood the chinampa system they tried to control. Some colonial records praise the productivity but offer no clue how it worked. Others complain that the natives ignore our instructions. One governor allegedly tried to flatten a series of chinampas and build stable roads across them. It sank within a week. You help an old woman gather herbs in secret. She tells you the temples are being destroyed, the priests taken, the codices burned. But the plants? The plants remember. She grows in silence now. For medicine. For memory. One French story you hear, whispered among the canoes, is of a priest-turned-farmer who tried to hide sacred seeds in bundles of squash. To keep them alive. To smuggle tradition beneath the noses of invaders. You like to believe it's true. But not everything can be saved. Over the next weeks, you see fences collapse, not from storms, but from neglect. Farmers vanish. Some flee. Some die. Some are forced to work plots they once owned, now under colonial supervision. The compost stops coming. The canals clog. No one dredges. The water turns still. You visit a chinampa that once grew 10 kinds of chili. Now, it's empty. The plants are gone. The willow posts lean like drunk ghosts. A single heron picks through the mud. You sit on the edge, suddenly aware of the silence. This floating paradise, the engine that fed an empire, is unraveling. One reed at a time. And yet, despite all of it, some continue. Quiet resistance. Old women whispering prayers into soil. Boys collecting canal mud when no one's watching. A healer still tending her herbs by moonlight. Not defiance. Continuity. The Spanish plant wheat. Grapes. European herbs. They try to tame the lake. They fail. Over time, some chinampas are repurposed. Others are drained. Some are converted into dry farmland, cut off from the water that once gave them life. But a few survive, tucked into corners where the invaders forget to look. You paddle through one such plot at sunset. It's small, rough, but alive. A boy tosses fish bones into the compost heap. A girl sings to her beans. A man whispers to the maize, not in Spanish, but in Nahuatl. You realize then, that chinampas weren't just farms. They were culture, language, memory. And though boots crushed their banks, they never touched the roots. You drift now over the quietest canal you've seen yet. No birds, no boats, no laughter from passing farmers. Just you, your little canoe, and the slow churn of water, brown and blank-faced. Beneath you, chinampas sleep. Some are just outlines, sunken borders of old willow frames and reed shadows buried in silt. Others look almost whole, but empty, as if someone left one day and never returned. You're paddling through memory now. This is where it all settled. As the centuries crept on, the floating gardens that once pulsed with color, harvests, and rituals began to vanish, sometimes fast, sometimes inch by inch. And not from conquest alone, not just from boot prints and taxes. No, this was a slow undoing. 1,000 quiet threads snapping one after another until the whole woven tapestry of the chinampa world began to sag and disappear into the lake. But let's not oversimplify it. After the Spanish arrived, the chinampas didn't just vanish overnight. For years, even decades, farmers kept tending them. Some plots continued to feed entire neighborhoods in the newly christened Mexico City. But change was creeping in, sneaky and constant, like saltwater under the reed mat. The colonial system didn't understand the communal nature of chinampa agriculture. Land had to be owned, titled, taxed. Suddenly, plots that had been passed down through generations of muddy hands had to be mapped and approved on Spanish paper. People who didn't read Spanish lost their land. People who refused to pay tribute lost their land. People who asked too many questions lost their freedom. And the lake itself? It began to shrink. The Spanish, eager for more dry land to build their new empire upon, started draining it. Bit by bit, dike by dike, they tried to tame Lake Texcoco like it was a wild animal to be locked in a cage. Canals were rerouted. Freshwater supply diminished. Salt crept back in. Historians still argue whether this massive draining project was born from ignorance or ambition. Either way, it worked too well. The water receded. The lake dried. And without water? The chinampas couldn't breathe. You pass a reed fence remnant now, jutting from the canal bank like a crooked rib. Once, it held a garden in place. Now, it holds nothing. You reach out and touch it, soft, brittle, like wet parchment. This is what remains of innovation without protection. But not all losses were caused by nature or colonial policy. There were other pressures. In the 19th and 20th centuries, rapid urbanization exploded across the Valley of Mexico. Mexico City, once a sparkling island of lakes and canals, grew teeth. Roads, concrete, plumbing, electricity, all necessary, all hungry. Entire sections of chinampas were bulldozed, paved, built over. Landfills rose. Trash found its way into canals. The sacred water turned grey. You visit a modern neighborhood now built atop old chinampa fields. A grocery store stands where amaranth once grew. A freeway slices through what was once canal. People walk here, oblivious to the floating world beneath their feet. And yet, look closer. In backyards, you see the shape of long, narrow plots. Some residents still grow herbs. Some still dredge mud. They might not call it chinampa anymore, but it echoes there, faint but insistent. One quirky tale you overhear: a man whose grandmother whispered secrets to the tomatoes. Not to help them grow, but to remember the names of the families who once farmed there. She said if the plants remembered, so would the land. You meet a researcher from the city university, standing thigh-deep in a canal near Xochimilco. She's dredging sediment, testing water quality, trying to map the old chinampa beds. We don't know how many are left, she says. Some are hidden under modern streets. Some are buried under trash. Some are right under our noses. She points to the water. There, she says. See that line of willows? That's not a random grove. That was a chinampa border. You squint and see it, a faint rectangle, just under the surface. Silted, shallow, but real. Like a footprint under fog. This isn't history. It's ghost cartography. There are stories of people who accidentally uncover chinampas while digging garden beds, who find old reed baskets, ceramic bowls, even obsidian tools stuck in the mud. Each find is a whisper, a root remembering its path. And now, we return to the question, what floats must settle? Yes. Eventually. But settle doesn't mean vanish. The chinampa system didn't disappear. It sank. And in doing so, it became part of the land. The mud. The memory. You paddle to the very edge of the canal, where the water turns shallow and the ground is more silt than liquid. You walk the final few steps along a sunken path where gardens once stood. With each step, your foot sinks slightly, and you can almost feel the layers beneath: reeds, silt, ash, dreams. This isn't ruin. It's compost. And from compost, things can grow. You take a final look at the sleeping chinampas, their outlines lost to time, their stories stitched into the mud. A bird lands on a crooked post, squawks once, then flies away. Maybe it remembers. You rise before the sun. The air is cool, heavy with dew, and the world feels like it's holding its breath. You're in Xochimilco now, an ancient name for a place that's still breathing, still paddling, still floating, long after the world forgot it was ever built from mud and dreams. You step carefully onto a narrow boat, not quite a canoe, not quite a barge. A trigenera. Painted bright yellow with fading flowers, it creaks as you step on, as if remembering the weight of history. Your guide gives you a sleepy smile and pushes off the dock with a long pole. The water parts quietly, shimmering gold in the early light. You're back among the chinampas. But something's different. They're alive again. After all the centuries of conquest, draining, neglect, and cement, this corner of the floating world survived. Barely. Fiercely. Against all odds. Xochimilco, the last stronghold of the chinampa system, still exists on the edge of Mexico City, like a whispered promise between generations. The boat glides through narrow canals lined with willows, just like before. But now you see color again. Maize stalks tall and proud, marigolds blooming in messy glory, herbs spilling over the edges. Farmers in straw hats dredge canal muck, hum lullabies, teach their kids how to tell healthy soil by smell alone. You're watching a rebirth. Or maybe a stubborn refusal to die. For the last few decades, a quiet revolution has been bubbling up from the lakebed. Locals, scientists, and environmentalists have banded together to protect, restore, and reimagine the chinampas, not just as a farming system, but as cultural heritage. Living memory. One farmer points proudly to his newly restored plot. "We are bringing back the old ways," he says. "But with new tools." His son nods, clutching a smartphone with a soil monitoring app open. Mainstream historians now agree, chinampas are a model for sustainable agriculture. Low-tech, high-yield, resilient, and circular. They use no fossil fuels. They purify water. They sequester carbon. And they don't just grow food, they grow communities. You meet a group of urban students volunteering on a restoration project. They plant amaranth, clean canals, monitor frog populations. One girl tells you she used to think the chinampas were a myth, something from textbooks and museum tours. Now she's waist-deep in compost, smiling like she's found something sacred. She has. Even the Mexican government is getting involved. Grants are being issued. Education programs launched. Chinampa produce is being sold at premium prices in high-end city markets. Organic, they call it now. But you and the mud know, it always was. You help plant seedlings in a newly revived plot. The soil is familiar, springy, dark, rich with memory. You smile as a boy splashes canal water onto your boots and tells you that his great-grandmother sang to the squash plants. You ask if he does, too. He shrugs. Sometimes. When no one's listening. You hear it anyway. There are still challenges. The canals are polluted in places. Development encroaches. Not everyone respects the work. But here, in this floating patchwork of resilience, hope sprouts like chili seeds in fresh mud. You pass a man in his 60s, crouched beside his plot. His hands are thick with soil. He doesn't speak, but he looks at you. And in his gaze, you see centuries of farmers, warriors, priests, poets, children, ancestors, all layered into one man, one chinampa, one stubborn plant refusing to wilt. Fringe thinkers now claim chinampas could be the future, not just of farming, but of city life. Floating gardens in urban wetlands. Resilient agriculture in climate-threatened zones. Living platforms for food, water, air. Maybe that's true. But for now, you're just here. Watching mist curl across the canal. Smelling maize warmed by the sun. Hearing the faint, rhythmic splash of paddles and voices echoing across water. You step off the boat onto solid, well, semi-solid, ground. The chinampa is still springy underfoot, still breathing, still listening. You kneel. Press your palm to the soil. It's warm. The mud floats again. And now, the light fades softly over the lake. The water settles once more into quiet ripples, and the willows sway gently overhead, like old friends whispering your name. The scent of the earth, warm and full of stories, lingers on your skin. You've walked through centuries tonight, through reeds and revolutions, through seeds and silence, through loss and return. You've seen mud lifted from the lake bed and turned into miracles. You've watched people whisper to the soil, and you've heard the soil whisper back. You've felt the weight of boots on gardens, of storms on willow frames, of memory on water. And still, the chinampas float. Not untouched. Not unchanged. But here, that quiet resilience, the calm insistence of floating earth, doesn't shout. It just continues. Slowly. Softly. Season by season. Root by root. So, as you ease into sleep, let yourself drift gently back across the water. Let the paddle sounds fade. Let the scent of marigolds and lake mist wrap around you. Let your breath slow, like the canals at twilight. You're not in a garden anymore. You're part of it. The water will hold you. The mud will welcome you. The willow roots will remember your name. Good night, floating gardener.